Good morning, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming today. It's such an exciting turnout for, a first-time conference on this. So how many people have never been to Clark before? How many is this your first time? Wow, fantastic. Welcome, welcome. So I'm Stephanie Cavino. You probably got a lot of emails from me. I'm from the Blackstone Watershed Collaborative that's hosted here at Clark University. And to orient ourselves of where we are, well, technically, right now we're in Tilton, right? And the restrooms, you're probably wondering, are right across the hall here, stay upstairs, and they're around the back of the mailroom. You can kind of go around either way. There's also a water fountain over there. And big picture-wise, we are in the headwaters of the Blackstone watershed. So you probably drove over either the Blackstone River or one of its tributaries on your way to get here today. And it's likely that you didn't see it. The Blackstone River has a very industrial past. We have dammed it many, many, many times and culverted it. We still have 19 dams on the main stem of our river. And we also have hundreds of dams and thousands more culverts watershed-wide, many of which are undersized. Our dams vary from being hydroelectric facilities to power local communities, hydroelectric facilities to power local industries, as well as some just kind of abandoned in the woods and have been partially breached already. Some are very historic. We have Slater Mill Dams, the very first one in 1796? 1792? All right. Got my numbers wrong here, guys. Luckily, we have an expert in the room. So thank you again for coming. I just wanted to make an acknowledgement that we consider this the Blackstone watershed. The Nipmuc call it Kittikuk. Kittikuk means Great Tidal River, as the Blackstone used to be tidal. And that we are currently on the unceded territory of the Nipmuc, Narragansett, Pokanoket, and Wampanoag. And those communities are not only the original stewards of the land, but are our current stewards as well, and some of our best allies in this conservation work. So thanks again for coming, and I'd like to introduce Beth Lambert, many of you which you may know her, and the director of the Massachusetts Division of Ecological Restoration.
Thank you, Stephanie, and good morning, everyone. Stephanie invited me here this morning to give the official welcome. So that is what I'm going to do. As Stephanie said, my name is Beth Lambert, and I'm the director of the Massachusetts Division of Ecological Restoration. The mission of the Division of Ecological Restoration, or DER, as I'll continue to say, is to restore and protect rivers, wetlands, and watersheds for the benefit of people and the environment. We work around the state with a variety of federal, state, local, and NGO partners on projects that restore rivers and wetlands to help people in nature, essentially. And a major focus of our work is dam removal, and we have a small 3-person, soon-to-grow, dam removal program of folks who focus exclusively on dam removal. And then we have a number of dam removal project managers in training as well. So I'm here with a bunch of other DER staff. Could you folks raise your hands so that everyone can see who you are? Put them up there. Up, thank you. So a number of these folks have dam removal expertise. Others are here to learn and are learning about dam removal, and so I encourage you to introduce yourselves and say hello to our DER staff. I should also mention that we're part of the Department of Fish and Game, and so helping people and nature adapt to climate change is a key focus of the Department of Fish and Game as well. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome you all to this important dam removal training. Today we have the privilege of gathering a diverse group of dedicated individuals representing state agencies, municipal government, and nonprofit organizations, all focusing on addressing aging infrastructure, restoring the health of our rivers and streams, and helping people and nature adapt to climate change. How many of you in this room have been involved in a dam removal project before? How many of you are currently involved in a dam removal project? And how many of you have not yet been involved in a dam removal project but expect to be or hope to be? Wonderful, excellent. So, this happens to be the first dam removal training put on by the restoration community in Massachusetts in more than a decade. So this is the first gathering of this type hopefully not the last, but the first gathering of its type in many years. And so I bring deep appreciation to Stephanie and to her team. So Stephanie and the Blackstone Watershed Collaborative really saw this need and jumped in to plan it and to bring a team of people together to help organize it. So I also bring deep appreciation and respect for the expert speakers that you will be hearing from throughout the day. In the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the relationship between dams and our natural environment is particularly pertinent. Massachusetts is home to more than 3,000 dams. In fact, Worcester County, where we are today, has the highest density of dams in the entire country. So what better place to have a dam removal training than here in Worcester and in Worcester County? A number of these dams, as Stephanie mentioned, throughout the state provide essential public benefits. That could be drinking water, that could be hydropower, it could be regional recreation. However, the vast majority were constructed in the 1700s and 1800s simply to power local mills, and they are long since obsolete, and they are deteriorating. In addition, they cost money to maintain, and they are a liability to their owners. As they age, they threaten downstream residents and businesses, as we saw recently in the city of Leominster. As the climate continues to change, and large storms continue to increase in frequency and magnitude, the threats posed by these dams and the environmental damage that they cause will only continue to grow. Dam owners are overwhelmed, and they need our help, and that's why we're all here today. Removing unwanted and aging dams is a common sense solution to these challenges. The good news is, over the last 15 years, we've witnessed significant progress in this field. Over 70 dams have been removed in Massachusetts over the last 15 years in every corner of the state. This trend reflects our collective understanding of the urgency of this situation and the need for collective action. Dam removal is an important nature-based approach to climate change. It's an integral part of the Commonwealth's approach to climate adaptation, meaning the administration, as well as all of the partners that are here today. This approach prioritizes resilience and the restoration of our natural ecosystems, and frankly, it makes a lot of economic and practical sense. With every dam that's been removed in Massachusetts, we've learned important lessons about dam removal challenges and benefits. So just to speak briefly to the benefits, because these are the things that inspire us. Removing a dam restores fish passage, restores floodplain function, improves water quality, and improves the free flow of water. And we can watch this happen in real time. Watching a river heal is one of the most inspiring things that you can ever see or be involved with. Dam removal creates jobs, at least 12.5 full-time jobs for every $1 million spent. It opens up opportunities for recreation, whether that's paddling or nature observation or fishing. Removes a liability that an owner is struggling with. It can reduce upstream flooding. And I've learned over the years that even people that are against the removal of a dam and really long to keep that impoundment that they have become accustomed to often say afterwards that they love the free-flowing river, the sound of the stream, and love watching nature return to that area. So on the challenges side of things, here in this room, we recognize that removing a dam can be technically challenging, it can be socially challenging, and financially challenging. And that is why we are all here today. I'm here to tell you, however, that despite these challenges, managing a dam removal project on behalf of an owner or a town or an NGO does not take a special degree. You don't have to be a scientist or a sociologist. The vast majority of dam removal projects in the state are managed by everyday people like me and like you. What skills do you need to manage a dam removal project effectively? Those of you that have been involved in dam removal will know that what you really need is common sense and good judgment. On top of that, you need the ability to think big picture and long term while also tracking the details of a project. You need an ability to ask tough questions of your engineering team. You need good communication skills. Managing a dam removal project is like managing any long-term, complex activity. Some compare it to conducting an orchestra. Others describe it as driving the cruise ship. Still others say it's more about coaching a team or directing a play. Today's training will expose you to some of the key topics in dam removal, while also hopefully demystifying the process. If you want more at the end of today, I am glad to tell you that the Massachusetts Rivers Alliance and the Charles River Watershed Association, along with DER, have organized a series of monthly Lunch and Learn dam removal webinars. And Monica from CRWA and Robert from Monica from Mass Rivers Alliance and Robert from CRWA are both here today. And Monica has information about that monthly Lunch and Learn webinar process over in the side there. It's free. It will cover a variety of dam removal topics, from sediment management to engineering and design to funding. We have a whole panel discussion set up and a variety of other topics. And so that is set up to complement this training that you're here for today. In conclusion, by coming together and honing our skills together, we'll be contributing to a more sustainable environment and future for both people and nature. I want to thank you for your dedication to rivers, to dealing with aging infrastructure, and to our environment. And I am thrilled to kick off this journey with all of you today. So let's get started. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth. Apologies that this hasn't been scrolling, but we do have many sponsors, so we appreciate all of our different sponsors that were able to make this happen today, because we really wanted it to be free and easy for folks to get to, and also you can't have a day-long conference without food, so please have breakfast at any time. So our next speaker is Jim Turek from NOAA, speaking about planning to implementation, recognizing and stepping through the process. Yeah, so you can just press whatever arrows there.
Okay, thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Beth, for that great intro. Before I get started, I would like to just acknowledge the terrible tragedies right now in Ukraine, Gaza, and now up in Lewiston, Maine. So pray for those people that are subject to this stuff right now, and it's not a good scene. We're in a lot better shape here. We're going to talk about some challenging topics today, but it's a lot better than some of those other folks have. So I'm going to acknowledge my co-presenter, Eric Hutchins. I'm sure most of you, if not all, know Eric as well as myself. And he and I combined, and he's not here today. He's getting ready to, I think, go down to Florida, and he's on his semi-retirement track. And so, but he and I collaborated on this presentation today. And I would say that between he and I, we have 50 years of dam removal experience. I ran a query of our database, and so we've worked on, NOAA's worked on significant work on dam removals, a total of 80 in New England, and Eric and I have worked on 71 of those. So that's where we kind of bring some thoughts today that I hope you appreciate, and I'm going to now move on with the next set of slides. So a little bit about just my outline, or our outline, of how we're going to cover this information today. And I'm glad to see that there are folks that have done some work with dam removals. And as you know, when you work on a dam removal, it's not always successful, but we hope to be successful. And we're going to talk about how you get there with this information that I'm about to present. So, as Beth said, it takes a group of people with skills, but a lot of it's just straight logic. But I do want to point out that the skill sets are essential to making these projects happen, And in essence, the people that are involved with these projects, they all may have different end goals of why they are involved with the dam removal, but there is a goal in common, and that is hopefully to remove the structure that is causing problems or liability, ecological impacts, and whatnot. And so with that, I'd like to then cover some of the collaborative process that we typically go through, followed by essentially covering a set of project conditions, constraints, and challenges, which are usually a gamut in almost any project we work on today. And then develop the strategies to advance the project implementation. And then I'm going to finish off with a little bit about cost, because people are always focused on how are we going to pay for these projects, because they're often very costly, and funding is a significant challenge for folks. Okay, so the first thing I do want to point out, though, I want to have a qualifier on the type of projects we're going to talk about today. And so, as Beth mentioned, many of the projects that we work on in Massachusetts and the rest of New England anyways are very old dams. They are typically relatively limited in size. They're typically less than 200 feet in length and no more than about 9 feet in height. And we have a whole data set that kind of points that out to everyone. And these are dams that were built, as Beth said, back anywhere from the 18th to 19th centuries, primarily as grist mills, textile mills, and or iron forge facilities, and maybe a few other things built in, cranberry bog management and that kind of stuff. And so that's what they primarily were constructed for, and as you could guess, a lot of those needs are no longer there, and so we have a set of essentially dams that really serve not much purpose, if any longer. And so now we're all, as a society, trying to figure out how we're going to deal with them. But anyway, I do want to point out that I'm not going to be talking about hydropower dams today, which are typically larger scale. They're usually set on larger river systems like the Connecticut River with the Holyoke Dam. We're not going to cover those today, but I do want to point out that literally last week, American Rivers, with Katie Schmidt as the lead author, put together a great document. If you haven't seen it, that's the web link, and if you need it, I can get it to you afterwards. But in essence, you got to take the time and go through that. And why we're not really covering that today is because these are larger scale projects that typically require a very formalized process, including basically surrendering the license by the willing owner, then decommissioning the dam through FERC in most cases, and then taking the dam out. And so that's a whole set of extra stuff that we're not going to focus on today, but maybe you folks, or at least some of you folks, at some point in time, will get to that. And you can see in the photograph in the upper right, that's so last year through the BIL funding, NOAA funded the Kinneytown Dam removal, which is a FERC dam that's being, the license is being surrendered. We're still it's been almost a year now, and we're still working on it, and it's a long-term endeavor. But anyway, we're holding Happy Fish up. If people understand the value of that is that World Fish Migration Foundation out of Europe, they have the Happy Fish as a symbol, and of course we had it for a while, and we sent it around the country doing different photo ops and stuff. But at any rate, these are things that I would say that go to that document. It'll be very helpful, and I know like Amy Singler, who I believe lives in East Hampton, I think still, she's a person that's well engaged with some of this work with American Rivers and the Nature Conservancy. Okay, so how do you get there in terms of looking at a project? It's building a project team, a dedicated project team that's going to be in it, hopefully for the long haul, because I'll talk about in a minute, these are typically not short term. And so, this is just an example here that I've presented with the type of folks that are involved, and it certainly varies from project to project. But the one person that we got to make sure is available and dedicated is the project manager. You cannot get these projects done with saying, hey, who can do this week, and start switching off. It doesn't work well, And so just like if you worked in a business, you got to have somebody that's a project manager that's going to help drive a project throughout, herding the cats and dealing with all the various issues that come about. And like I said earlier, there are folks that get engaged as partners in these projects that have different goals, And so just as examples, the project town manager. He or she may be set out to, find ways to, minimize costs of the town. The town solicitor may have issues about liability. How are we going to take care of this? Somebody drowned in the hydraulic below the dam 2 years ago, blah, blah, blah. And so these are all things that come about and become factors in how you look at these projects. And of course, there's the funding aspect of where you capture funds. And of course, then there's non-governmental organizations like the Nature Conservancy and American Rivers, and a lot of the watershed groups that were shown as help today with this conference. These are all folks that are essential to making these projects happen, and even down to having a good grant writer. I live in a small town of about 7,800 people. And we have pushed for years to try to have the town at least hire a grant manager part-time, and we have failed over the years, sadly. And so then, like my day yesterday was working on a grant application on behalf of the town. I work as the Conservation Commission chair in my town now for 22 years, and so these are like sweat equity in your free time, and so it's kind of tragic. But my main point here is you may be working with a small town government that really needs a lot of help. They may not understand a lot of the issues, and so they need guidance and a lot of help in different ways, technical and just using logic, like Beth said. Okay, so I'm now going to kind of walk through so in my mind, it's a 5-step process that we all go through when we do these projects. And, but inserted in that, we've put down, public engagement. And so I just want folks to understand that, and I've learned this the hard way myself over the years, is that, you may think, or your team may think that you have all the great technical and knowledge and experience in working with these, and you say, we know what we're doing, so we're just going to move along. But the reality is there's a whole town of residents and people that are interested in rivers for different purposes and needs, and we'll kind of cover that in a little while. And so you cannot avoid that public engagement, and it's essential that no matter how hard it is, some people find it very difficult, like, well, we don't want to go there until we have to. And I have a couple partners right now that it's kind of hard for them to have that vision, that no matter how difficult it may be, you really need to engage the public as soon as you can during and throughout the process. So anyway, that's my little spiel on the public engagement aspect, but I do want to point out that, so we have the upfront assessment and feasibility analysis, and so that, of course, is like looking at what are all the potential conditions of the site, whether it's the dam itself or the impoundment, the sediments underlying the impoundment, the downstream conditions with bridges and culverts or underground utility pipes and whatnot, and so you got to put all that information together. Some folks can do it as part of the team, and if additional information is needed, then essentially someone's got to find a contractor, an engineering consultant, to help out in getting that work done. Which then leads into, again, after public engagement, trying to let people know about what the lead entity with its partners want to do, would like to do, and at least look at what are the options. Then you move into that design phase, and of course there's a whole set of phases within that, from conceptual to preliminary design to draft final to final, and then 100% plans and bid documents, that get you there. And then before you get to the bid documents, so, and the 100% plans, of course, there's the permitting aspect, and so you got local, Concom, state and federal, and so that in itself is another phase that we need to go through, make sure that we're addressing any concerns that the regulators have, hopefully securing the approvals in a reasonable amount of time. And then once that's all said and done, then the construction bidding process begins, and then hopefully we get to an implementation. And then lastly, there's always the, after the work is done, you still have potential challenges with adaptive management. You're trying to fix something that someone may not have anticipated, and it's inevitable that that's always going to come up. It's a matter to what scale and magnitude that adaptive management is. And then there's the performance monitoring. Are the fish passing as we projected? Is the wetland, floodplain wetland restoring as we expected with a seed bank? And all those different items that come into play with performance monitoring, which is very important. So when we talk about these 5 processes and the time frame, I want people to understand that these are sometimes and often lengthy time frames to get this work done. And these all depend on the scale of the project, but of course the complexity of the project. And so you can kind of see, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I tried to put together what I believe were reasonable time frames on carrying out this work. And so you have these, and I put these in months in the end. And so, of course, with the design, that's typically the longest because you're going through that multiple phase of design plans and whatnot and public input. And so, that could take up to a year and a half or so. In some cases, even longer. And this is just the rest. But, so we go through the, so building a project, and I have 12 months on there, kind of like as a typical reasonable upper limit, but of course some of that is even longer too, depending, like for example, if you run into unexpected utilities or a legacy dam, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, a dam that was behind the dam that you're focused on all suddenly shows up because it was in the impoundment that you never knew expected to be there, and that happens more than you can imagine. But when you put it all together, it's typically 3.5 to 7 years. Back in 2018, I worked with a graduate student. We actually analyzed the data we had for 53 dam projects that we had worked on in New England, and it came out to be 4.8 years, and that was back in 2018, when in the earlier time frame. When we did this work, some of the projects were what we would define as lower hanging fruit, and now as we're getting into more complex projects and a society, to be honest, that's somewhat at rest and often divisive, these are things to keep in mind. Okay, so I want to quickly cover 7 project constraints and challenges, and so this is just a list of them, but the key is to understand these are a set of constraints that Eric and I have developed. We believe that these are the key items that people are always engaged with through the process. So property ownership, so essentially we need a willing owner. And so I will say, I guess 65% of the dams in the United States are privately owned. And my guess, and that's American Rivers data, but I would guess that in New England it's probably a quite substantially higher percentage being private owners. So you gotta find those owners, or in some instances, town government that basically become willing owners. And in some cases, like on the photo on the upper right, that was a dam removal we worked on in Rhode Island, and that was interesting in that on the right-hand side of the looking downstream of the dam was owned by the town of Richmond, where I live, and then the left-hand bank was owned by the town of Charlestown. So you had 2 different owners because the town line went down the middle of the river, and so we had two owners. And so, that the key is, when we get to these projects, is incentivizing the owners to doing dam removal, as to explaining in a very simple manner and using facts, right? We want to be factual on how we carry this work out. With dam safety deficiencies, if there's a consent order that's by the state saying you've got to fix your low-level outlet, these are things that we want them to be aware of, and we can find ways to take care of their problem. And so grant funding, of course, is extremely valuable, and then providing that technical assistance and the project management is key. And then, of course, there's a whole set of different ways that you can try to get the folks to hopefully have a better understanding of why we could do that dam removal as an option. So engineering considerations, so dam safety, of course, every state has an Office of Dam Safety, and so you're looking at the whether it's significant or high hazard dams. It's looking at the mill structure and any other structures or utilities on a site. Like in those photos, you can see there's a covered bridge in the upper right where we took that dam out, but we first had to stabilize the central pier of that covered bridge circa 1832 construction to make sure it's not going to be adversely affected with the down, basically channel bed adjustment once you take the dam out. And then in a similar fashion, you can kind of see in the right-hand lower photo is you've got a public road, and then you've got a utility going across, and if you take the dam out and you got channel bed adjustment, will that system be stable? And so that's just one of the main factors you got to look at in these projects. And then water management, of course, with the two photos in the bottom are good examples, whether it's a porta dam, using super sacks to do your water management, and many other activities that come along with that. And then, of course, impounded sediment and looking at the transport and disposal issues with them. More engineering considerations. So there's a photo on the right, second set down. That's basically a channel down cutting once the dam came out up in New Hampshire. There's a picture there that Eric had about one of his projects, I think, over in Plymouth, Mass, where, with the down cutting, it was starting to impact a local road and the culvert underneath it. And then, as I mentioned, the two bottom photos there are legacy dams, and essentially those are great challenges. And Eric has been working on the Armstrong Dam now in Braintree, which the photo shows. It's kind of hard to see it, but they found a legacy dam out there. Environmental conditions, of course, mussels, freshwater mussels often become a significant issue. The four mussels in my hand there, the smallest one is actually the federally endangered dwarf wedge mussel, and we found a number of them in one of the products we worked on, and you basically deal with relocation, but you're also looking at wetlands, the migratory fish passage needs, and habitat restoration for those species. And then in some cases, you may be looking at tidal hydrology, where a dam's at the head of tide. Permitting, as I talked about earlier, of course, a lot of it focuses on what do you do with managing the sediments. There's the water quality certification that often does come up in almost all cases for doing these projects, as well as wetland permits. The time of year restrictions that basically allow in-river work because of the fact that fish or other organisms have maybe adversely impacted when you're releasing sediments. And so there's a lot of work, of course, that goes into the regulatory requirements. All right, I got to really crank through this. So cultural considerations, we basically have Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act when you have a federal action, including funding. And so Eric and I and my colleagues and others in the federal government that fund these projects are on the hook, to make sure we consult with the state historic preservation offices. Every state has one. We have tribal historic interests, of course, in New England, and there's 10 federally recognized tribes in Connecticut, Mass, and Rhode Island. And so we have to keep track of all those and consult with them, as well as local historical societies and other interested parties. And again, there are things like the legacy dam discovery that you never can anticipate until you find it. Societal needs, social interest. I think one of the key pieces with this is that water supplies. And so the upper right-hand photo, that's a private water well, shallow water well. They typically only go down, down to 15, 20 feet. So that project, we actually had a well go dry, and actually 3 went dry a year after we took the dam out. It took a while for the system to adjust. And so you have potential private well water supply issues as well as commercial. The photos in the bottom right, that's a firm that actually is a textile company still in business, and they of course had a fire suppression need to withdraw water from the river to put the water then into that tank of water in back of the mill there. And then there's a whole bunch of different interests that local folks have, including at the end, the personal sentimental values. I've heard them all from, I love to go bass fishing on that pond. I met my wife on the dam, and so everybody's got sentimental values that don't become small in some instances. And then, of course, there's the political landscape and the climate. And so, basically the local and state officials have key roles in the whole process and the decision making, and so we have to keep that in mind to understand what's their perception, whether it's at the town council or the town manager. And of course, opinions and staff changes occur, and so you may have one project manager, a town manager that's on board, and the next one that comes in doesn't want to do the project. And we had that happen in Greenfield, with the Wiley-Russell Dam. And then you have special interest groups that they sort of coalesce when things start to evolve, and they all have their own thoughts, and not that it's bad, but it happens. And then you have what's called the ambushers, in my mind, as a social contingency, where they kind of come out of nowhere with some kind of issues that you could never envision. And so the most important thing here is consensus building is paramount. You've got to start to build consensus on these. And so in the end, you have a range of potential outcomes. So hopefully the best is you get the full dam removal, and everybody understands the great value of addressing all those goals that I mentioned earlier. But in some cases it doesn't happen, and so then you look at, can you do partial removal, whether you're taking part of the dam out, and slicing it in a portion, or you're taking some of it down and then potentially putting in a nature-like fishway. And so anyway, these are all pieces that come apart, as you move down to the process. And in some cases, the dam stays in, and either a tentacle fishway is built, or a bypass around the dam, or in a rare cases, nothing happens. And the last thing I'll just talk about is the project costs. I know I got to wrap up here, but this is people always are asking about this. So I have done work on this. I'll mention it at the end here, but I do want to point out that there are. So basically, engineers typically use RS means when they develop their costs, at least in part, and sometimes that RS means needs to be modified by experts, put actual data into it. And so that's one way that's done. Recently, there was this predictive cost model that's been developed. It's based upon 6 variables, and it could be used across the country. It's okay, but it's a way to start, and it doesn't cost you anything. You can get it done probably in about 10 minutes. So, it kind of gives you an understanding there. And then, but I do want to point out, and so in 2018, worked with a grad student, and we put together, we analyzed 53 dam removal projects we did in the Northeast between 2007 and 17, including, fish passage project, and 37 were dam removals, and they with the mean height of 8.9 feet. And so then we put it into 2018 dollars using the consumer price index when we had to put it to one particular year. And then ultimately you come up with a cost per foot rise of the dam that you're dealing with. And so here's the data from 2018. The interesting thing is you see with dam removal, so at that time the mean was about $115,000 per foot rise. So if you have a 10-foot high dam, that's about 1.1 million. So I did use the CPI to then convert it very quickly to current conditions in September of 2023, and that cost has increased by 22%. And so now a dam removal is about $140K per foot rise. That's what I just wanted you to know. And you can kind of see all the various aspects that help, or will have an effect, I should say, on these costs. And so, and those are a lot of the things I covered earlier today. But the key is you understand that it's not inexpensive, it takes time, and it takes a lot of folks. So I'm sorry I ran over, and I appreciate you listening today and having all the skills that you guys have to make these projects happen.
Thank you so much, Jim. So we have a few minutes for questions. If you want to just raise your hand, I'll walk over to you because we want to be able to capture everything on the mic. I know you have questions. There was so much information there.
Thank you. Just a comment that I'm really glad to see first the land acknowledgement for the Native American communities who have cultural affiliation with this area, and the mention about tribal consultation, which is a requirement for any federal activity or funding that might in fact trouble interests. But I would also recommend, as folks consider dam removal, to include tribes as in the list of project partners, potential project partners. I've been involved for many years with dam removal projects in New England, and the tribal input, it might be their ancestral waters, it might be waters that lead to their waters, but of course this leads to the cultural importance of water and Anadromous fish passage and that kind of thing. So the Native American community has a lot more than just the historic preservation component. They have typically other interests as well. So just wanted to make that comment. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great point, yeah, and you're absolutely right. And I'll give you an example. So we've worked on the High Street dam removal over in East Bridgewater, and so one of the folks or I should say, several people from the Massachusetts tribe who are not federally recognized have been engaged as part of that process to keep them involved because they expressed an interest. But he's absolutely right. They may not serve directly as a tribal TIPO, but they should be always considered and encouraged to be partners on a project.
My name is Gail Berrigan. Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering if you could talk for a few minutes about what you do to assess upstream and downstream impacts. Are there any standard practices you use? How far do you go? Can you respond to that?
Yeah, so there are pretty standard protocols. With upstream assessment, without question, you're going to the limits of the dam. I'm sorry, not the dam, the head pond created by the dam. And so if it's 300 feet or 6.5 miles, that's the minimum you're going to try to do, is get to the upper limits of the head pond that have an effect on the system. After that, you're welcome to go further upriver. That might serve as a reference stations and whatnot, but if you certainly need to look at sediments. Sediments are critical to figuring out the quantity and the quality of those sediments. So if you have contamination, it's going to determine whether or not you can passively let the sediments be transported downriver, with dam removal, or they need to be excavated out and disposed of somewhere. And so that becomes quite critical. And of course, the other piece in particular are utilities. So if it's a bridge with a bridge abutment, or under a subsurface sewer line that runs either in the floodplain or across the river, those are all things that have to be back-checked. Those are standards. The downstream is going to be focused primarily on infrastructure, but also the issues with understanding existing flooding, what would happen in a catastrophic failure of the dam to downstream homes, businesses, and infrastructure. And so those are the standards. After that, you're doing reconnaissance on potential mussels and other potential state-listed or federally listed species. And so there are a gamut of those, but those are pretty important and pretty standard, and I'm probably missing some, but that kind of gives you the most important ones anyway.
Hi, I'm Dan Galanti at T. Ford Company. You showed the timeline that listed out, approximate time frames for different phases of the project. As a contractor, we've worked on a number of these projects, and oftentimes the front page plan sheet almost needs 2 sheets because of how many funding sources it took to get to that point. You didn't necessarily list exactly as far as, when the funding requests begin or how that sort of goes, but is that something before you even embark on, the first phase, you've secured a certain amount of money, or is it just a process that goes in parallel with the rest of it?
I think they run in parallel primarily. Not that we wish we had, everything right in tune and say, let's build a budget before we start the project. In the end, you try to find out what the project may be, and then you understand those phases that I spoke about, and then try to match up what you anticipate as being the funding levels for those. And in general, if we were really good at what we did, we'd probably be planning for how are we going to get the $4.2 million, for 4 years down the road. But the way our governments work, it's not always that straightforward. So I would just say that we do the best we can. And I think the most important piece is once you get a group together that has the goal, whether it's a town, an NGO, or a combination thereof, you start to say, let's at least get the basic information to start that, that upfront feasibility analysis to kind of understand what are the constraints that are going to have an effect on driving the ultimate cost of the project. So, kind of like, I think it's running more or less in parallel and through that step phase process. And that's about the best I think we can do.
And we'll also be talking about funding with Bill Hinckley in our last presentation. Beth gets the last word on this one.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jim. That was great. For folks that want more information on the process that Jim outlined, American Rivers has a variety of manuals for dam removal project managers, and those manuals step through all of these things that Jim shared with us, but due to time constraints, couldn't wade into all of them. So I highly recommend the American Rivers resources. The state of Massachusetts also has a manual for dam removal project managers. It's old. It was published in 2007, I want to say. But the process of removing a dam has not changed, over the last 15 years. It's the same steps. Costs are different, higher, but same steps. So if you Google Massachusetts dam removal guide, you'll find it. And again, it walks through the same things that Jim shared and in more detail. So I recommend all of those resources.
Thank you. And that's a great reminder that I have an Excel sheet of resources that our speakers helped put together today. It's not pretty yet. I was hoping to kind of make it into a pretty one-pager and send it out to you. But I promise in some fashion or form, I will give you a follow-up with lots of great resources. And that is one of the best ones. So thank you so much, Jim. Okay, next up we have Neil Shea, the Restoration Program Director from the Ipswich River Watershed Association.
Morning, everyone, and thanks for inviting me to speak today, and thanks to the Blackstone River Watershed Collaborative and Clark and Steph Cavino for putting this all together. It's a super exciting time to be involved in dam removal, and I'm glad that there's so many people here to work with and collaborate with. So, like Steph said, I'm Neil Shea. I'm the Restoration Program Director at Ipswich River Watershed Association. We're the nonprofit NGO for the Ipswich River Watershed. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about getting public support and how do we define goals and what successful outreach and buy-in looks like on these projects. I noticed in Jim's slide on kind of the steps implementations, there's at least three different mentions of public support, public engagement. So it's important and definitely can't be underestimated. So little bit of a background about me. I'm, like Beth said in the beginning, a lot of us aren't experts, and I'm not a dam removal expert, I'm not an engineer, and I'm definitely not an expert on outreach and engagement. I just fake my way through it. And so I'm a watershed scientist. That's what my background is in. But part of this journey is kind of learning about how to distill some of this stuff. So I've worked on a few dam removal projects, West Coast and East Coast. So today I really just kind of want to relay some tidbits that I've learned along the way, and hopefully that they're helpful. So framing this whole talk, first of all, why should you even care about public support? A lot of these dams are privately owned, so why can't we just get in there and take them out? Talk a little bit about translating the science. A lot of these feasibility studies are hundreds, if not close to 1,000 pages long. How do you distill those and make that information digestible to the public? And then I also want to talk about strategies for people. So who is your audience? How do you identify them? And how do you talk to them? And then I want to end on a few case studies, because I feel like those often are kind of the best ways to wrap your head around these things. So first off, why care about public support? The majority of dams in New England are privately owned. So if you have a willing landowner, why can't you just get in there and do it? It sounds easy enough, but you'll find that there's lots of reasons to care. So dam removals can have wide-reaching impacts. Like Jim was talking about, you can sometimes go miles upstream or miles downstream in terms of what you're going to be impacting. And so you have to account for anything and everything that might be impacted. Your neighbors, your water supply intakes or wells, endangered species, protected resource areas, infrastructure, all these things you're going to have to be thinking about. So it's not just the dam at that location. And these projects are just divisive by nature. I think they've been politicized, especially recently. You know, dam removals for bleeding heart liberals and crunchy granolas. There's no other way around it, and they've just been. It's just seems like it's heading in that direction. So, but they also are divisive because they are very nuanced, and there's a lot of issues to deal with. And so any one of those issues might have a passionate group of supporters that you have to deal with and interact with. And so, and additionally, being from New England, you know, I grew up in Massachusetts. I went to school down the street in Worcester. And so I think dams are just closely linked with our local histories and cultures. And so when you picture that quaint small town New England aesthetic with fall foliage, that image often has a dam inside of it. And so you know, there's just this extra level of connection that we often have to deal with the public. And so it's probably true of a lot of places, but I just think especially so in New England, people just don't love change. And so people see a dam, they assume it's been there forever, they assume it must be culturally or historically important, and that, you know, the local ecosystem behind it has adapted to the dam, so taking the dam out is destroying that. And so but in reality, you know, a lot of these things, the vast majority are 150 to 200 years old, you know, just a blip in time over the real natural history of these rivers. And so, and usually any upstream ecosystem is there in spite of the dam, not because of it. So that's an important thing to kind of frame as you go forward. One thing about dam removal that you'll find is that there's endless opportunities for puns, and you might hate them or love them, but they'll always be there. And so, but the other good thing about working on these projects in New England is that there's been a lot of these projects already done. So there's been the opportunity for people to look in kind of the social science side of things and not just the hard science. So how do people wrap their heads around these projects, and what are the best ways to deal with them? And so, so each one of these projects is super unique. There's no two that are ever going to be the same. But one commonality, and it's going to sound way oversimplified, is that you work for public buy-off and support, because the more support a project has, the less resistance you're going to encounter. Again, sounds way oversimplified, but in my experience, just the more hearts and minds you can win over and change, the easier that road is going to be from beginning to end. And so the research shows, specifically to New England, that in general, people are in support of dam removals, but those margins start to narrow when the dam has a real or perceived function. So A lot of times, for example, in New England, people see a dam and they think it's, holding back a wall of water. It's protecting the downtown from a flood. So that's not a real function, that's a perceived function, but it's still important to address. And so that's why it's so key to a lot of these, you really do have to get down to the individual level. What are the misconceptions about the project? How can I educate and inform to the best of your ability to make sure that at the very least, people have the right information? So how can you talk about these projects in a way where you make sure those narrow margins go in your favor? So as a person with a science background, this part's kind of the most interesting to me. And I've learned a lot along the way how important kind of science communication is. So much of this stuff is dry and boring to the general public, but it's so important to talk about. And so these projects typically have years of research, data collection, and analysis on topics like hydraulic and hydrologic modeling, sediment transport, sediment contamination, structural engineering. How do you take all that and distill it down to be digestible by the public? And so these studies, like I said, are hundreds and hundreds of pages, and you just simply cannot expect the public to wade through that. You'll have some people who are willing to do that, but most are not going to be interested in that. And so, take something like a HEC-RAS model. Somebody was asking about how do you determine the upstream and downstream impacts. Like running hydrologic modeling is critical because that's the way you can compare pre and post conditions. But something like this isn't often intuitive to look at by the general public. As a scientist, you can look at that and read that, but how do you distill that to people? So I kind of think about it like this, that like each section of those feasibility reports, like Jim talked about, is kind of meant to tell a story and paint a picture about the project. So the H&H modeling, hydrologic modeling, uses highly technical math and geometry equations to compute water levels and velocities. But at the end of the day, when somebody asks, hey, what's this going to look like upstream? You're going to want to know why. You're going to want to know how to explain those results and why we can trust them. So a lot of people will say, I can't trust a computer model or something like that, but HEC-RAS is literally used by the Army Corps of Engineers and to build and massive engineering projects. So it's something that you can, but you have to be able to know how to explain that. And so same thing with things like sediment and water quality sampling. The list of things that you have to test for that DEP, on the list of DEP contaminants, you probably can't even pronounce half of them. And so what's behind the dam and where's it going to go? You have to be able to talk about these things. And at the end of the day, what do those results mean? Same thing for infrastructure impacts. In New England, we have a lot of our dams are built right downtown, and we have buildings that are essentially on or even in some cases over the river. So how do buildings, roads, bridges, how are they going to be impacted by these things? And so that's when the modeling and some of these things kind of interplay, where we need to be able to talk about, a business owner comes up to you and asks you, what's going to happen to my building? You need to be able to explain that. And same thing with an archaeology assessment. So like I said earlier, a lot of things are perceived to be historical, when in reality, you need to consult the right people to tell you if that's the case. A lot of dams might have been built and rebuilt over time, and so they're really not that historical at all. So, and again, so what kind of tools can you use when you're translating the science? I would say a good set of visually appealing but scientifically accurate renderings is crucial. They come in handy for tons of situations, especially when you have highly visible and public projects. A good set of clear and concise maps. You're going to want to have a set of few that show different things, like to answer questions like how far up and downstream are there going to be impacts, or what's the difference in flood elevations before and after. You're going to want to have these tools to be able to show to people. And same thing, one of the most important tools you can have is a tightly organized and edited FAQ document. So I would say this can and should change over time. New questions come up, new data becomes available. You want to have one of these as almost a living document that shows that even though the work is actively evolving, that you have a good handle on what the issues are, because something's always going to come up. And then another critical tool is obviously the public meeting. So public meetings can be tough to get through. They're pretty much guaranteed to have uncomfortable moments. Should be ready to get beat up on a little bit, but the more you practice having difficult conversations, the easier it's gonna get. And I'd be lying if I were to say I've kept my cool through every public interaction I've had. So it's easy to get fired up. And but as passionate as you are about removing the dam, there's gonna be at least a few folks that are as passionate about keeping it. So how do you deal with those folks? And should you deal with those folks is a question that's going to be kind of unique to every project. So this is something I just kind of made up this week, but I think it works for this situation where it's like, I just called it the sliding scale of who cares. And so it's highly scientific, obviously, and something you should use very carefully. On the x-axis here, you have starts with against the project all the way towards for the project, and then down below you have like disengaged versus engaged. And so by that I mean like how active and vocal and involved people are. So people at the top are going to be attending every public meeting, writing letters to the paper, stuff like that. So I wanted to give some examples of some people who you might encounter here. And so first off, you have your extreme upper left quadrant people. I call these people the naysayers. And so these are the people who are leading the charge against the project, and they will throw anything at the wall to see what sticks, even if it's, not based in fact. And so it's up to you to decide how much you want to deal with this group of people. There might be, some of these dots on this graph might be entrenched. You're never going to move them. But some of them you might be able to shift. And so you kind of have to judge how much time you want to spend on this group, but knowing that it is an important group to engage with, at least occasionally. The next group of people is, I think, the people that make up the majority of folks in New England who are for dam removal that I mentioned earlier, but in general they are for ecological restoration and recognize that if a dam serves no function, that it should be taken down. But they kind of run the gamut in terms of engagement, but you want to make sure that these folks stay on your side. And so even though you might have people who are on the either side of the engagement axis, it's important to make sure that you keep these people with you. Another group of people is kind of one of the more critical groups, is kind of your champions, your project champions. And these are the folks that are going to go to bat for your project. They're going to be, in the trenches on social media. They're going to be going to public meetings and speaking in favor in the dam. This is the counterpart to that upper left group. But, and I've found that this group, for whatever reason, is usually smaller than that upper left quadrant. But again, super important group to engage with. And then one of the more important groups is just kind of the folks in the middle. These are the people that are undecided, uninformed, or a mix of both. And it's super critical to engage with this group, and at the very least, just make sure that they have the information they need to make a decision on their own. So I think that's very key. And so, how to garner support. This is, again, oversimplified, but who is your audience? Who you're going to be talking to? And you want to figure out what the pros are to your specific dam removal. Some are going to be very ecology-centric, fish-centric, but you want to also go beyond those reasons. Why else is it important to take that dam out? Have your talking points. And then you also want to acknowledge what are the most popular reasons why people would want to keep the dam. You need to know what those reasons are going to be and be able to talk about them. If they're perceived or real, either way, you want to be ready to have those conversations. So I want to get into just like a few quick case studies. One is a project that's not local to here. It's a West Coast project, but I wanted to talk about it because I think it represents one end of the spectrum for dam removal projects. It's kind of like your slam dunk. There's minimal barriers to completion. It's not very publicly visible. As you can see here, it doesn't get much more slam dunk than salmon ramming their heads into a dam that has like rebar sticking out of it. And so it's just an absolute mess. And so we were lucky to get that footage. And so again, I don't want to talk too much about specifics because it's not super relevant being on the West Coast, but there are some universal things that hold true. And talking about habitat loss, it's a problem that we have here in New England with our dams too. So we're dealing with more and more development pressures all the time. The amount of habitat loss and fragmentation that has occurred both out west and in New England is severe. And it's one of the main reasons native fish populations have declined. So talking about reconnecting those habitats is key. And then also, not to dive too deep, but I love this figure talking about migratory fish and how they're going to be impacted by climate change. And so it is going to have an impact on these species. So across the board, these fish usually rely on environmental cues to trigger certain segments of their life cycles. And so as we experience kind of changing precip patterns and temperatures, that's going to have a huge impact on those fish populations. So it only makes that habitat loss hurt that much more, because not only is there less habitat, there's also going to be less functional habitat over time. And again, another kind of just graph, the main thing to look at is, you have one graph that has some ups and downs, and then the graphs on the right-hand side are pretty all across the board on the decline. But what do those mean? Dams aren't the only reason that these fish are experiencing declines, but we do know that they fragment and prevent access to habitat and spawning and rearing grounds. So you need to be able to discern and determine, how big of a factor are my dam removal projects in something like fish population decline. So on this project, I worked for a Native American tribe out in Washington State, and we had a pretty small science staff, so we had to outsource our public outreach and stakeholders engagement. But again, for this project, not very visible. We had a super small community of abutters. We're kind of tucked up in the woods. There's not a whole lot going on. And so from that point of view, it was pretty easy. We're knocking on doors, we're handing out brochures, and we're just talking to people. And then again, press, you want press to be your friend. I'm gonna sound like a political pundit or something, but as much as you can control the narrative on your project, the more successful you're gonna be. So you wanna highlight your project wins and make sure that you really pat your own back when you complete a project, because getting any one of these done is monumental. And you also want to be able to know how to distill your project down to a few talking points, because at the end of the day, people aren't going to dive too deep into the reports or the feasibility studies. They're going to want the headlines and the tidbits. So what was good about your project, and why was it good that it succeeded? And then this being dam removal conference, I wanted to at least show some footage of a dam being removed. One of my colleagues on this project was a rock climber, and so he climbed about 70 feet up into a tree and put a game camera, and so we were able to capture time-lapse footage of this project as it went on. And so pretty cool to look at, and one of the main things I wanted to highlight here was just how quickly nature can bounce back here. And so it was, within the year, over one winter. So, and then running out of time a little bit, but wanted to just quickly talk about a local one. So folks who were at the most recent MVP / EEA field trip would have seen this project in Ipswich. It's the Ipswich Mills Dam. And so, what happened here? And so, super brief project background. It's an old mill dam, and it's been going on for 15 plus years from when initial reconnaissance happened. But we just recently filed with MEPA a few weeks ago, and so it ranks in the 95th percentile for all restoration value coastal dams from Maine to Virginia. Restore 49 miles of habitat and enhanced passage for fish, wildlife, and recreators. And so one strategy that we did for this was, leading up to a 2023 town meeting vote, we opened up a pop-up shop downtown where we invited the public to come. We had no idea how this was gonna go, but we allowed people to have some face-to-face conversations, hosted weekly engagement opportunities, and just had people come downtown. So, and the town meeting vote carried 314 to 144. So it was not entirely because of our engagement efforts, but I think it was a big part. And just quickly as we wrap up, just some lessons learned. Be clear about your decision making, be strategic about where you spend your time, and people love furry wildlife. We had multiple wildlife rescues that we consulted on with DMF and Mass Wildlife. Otters stuck below the dam. Pretty sad, just like for a long time trying to get over the dam. And so capturing these moments, and this is our most viewed Instagram reel of all time, like by far. And so we're lucky to have an on-staff outreach person who does a great job putting this stuff together, and it's just one more way you can kind of engage with people. So thank you for your time, and sorry I went a little bit over.
Thank you, Neil. I think ending on a river otter is a great way there. Always want those iconic species. Questions for Neil? Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned early that talked about ownership of dams. And have you, or actually, it's just a question that anybody in the audience has had experience where ownership cannot be established. It's a conundrum, and the town, the owner has disappeared. And in our project, we did a sort of a study to look at that, a tidal research study, and came up with nothing. And I think that may be more common, especially in New England, than we think.
Yeah, and I know there's definitely people in this room that know more about that than me, but I will say I've heard about it more and more recently, and that there are mechanisms for towns to take over properties that have, absentee landowners, or at least haven't paid their taxes, but there's definitely some people in here that I think would be able to answer that for sure.
Coming in the back there.
Neil, that was great. I just wanted to put a point on something that you touched on. I love that graph, and I think that graph highlights the thing I want to point out, that I'm probably taking words out of Beth's mouth here, but I think a thing to remember in that public engagement piece, if you haven't done it before, is your job isn't to win everyone over, and your job is definitely not to win an argument in a public meeting. So that those people in the middle, those people that might move over, that are looking for the scientific information, your job is to pull them over. Arguing with those people over at the top left corner is just going to pull those people in the middle either into the disengaged or into the no. So your job is to give the facts, answer people's questions, let people be heard, let people's opinions be heard, and make people feel like they're included and kept in the loop, not things are happening in a smoky room somewhere. So that's all I just wanted to add. It was a great presentation.
Absolutely. I know as fun as it is to mix it up and get in the mud sometimes, it usually gets you nowhere. So a lot of times people just want to be listened to, and at the very least you can do that. But yeah.
Yeah, just to follow up, Neil, with one project we worked on was on the Patuxent Dam in Cranston and Warwick, Rhode Island, half and half, and that had essentially an unknown owner, and it took us about, I think it was almost 3 years before we were able to pin down the water supply board that actually was the owner, but there was no reason why we needed to keep the dam, and it's near the head of tide. But the other point I'd want to make also is that we had 8 public meetings on that project, and there were over 200 people that were showing up for those meetings. And as Brian said, you're not necessarily trying to outdupe somebody, but the great thing about those sets of meetings I went to every one, I helped with them, is you gradually saw the participants changing their attitude towards moving forward on that project. And I remember the last meeting we had, there was only one person that really disagreed, at least vocally, with the dam removal, and that was one of the state congressmen. And we couldn't figure out exactly why he didn't want the dam removal, but we found out later on that his one of his brothers had passed away early on in his life because of, well, supposedly he thought playing in the sediments in the impoundment, which it was contaminated. And but I do remember that last meeting. There was an older gentleman that stood up and he goes, "Take the damn dam out!" And of course, the entire audience clapped, and then we all walked out. We knew we had moved forward after 8 meetings, and so it does take persistence. That took 4 years, but just to give you an example.
Absolutely. And sometimes you have to say things not once, not twice, but 10 times. But when you do start to win people over, it's kind of one of the more gratifying things, for sure.
Hi, Corinne Meisemans with the town of Longmeadow. I was wondering if you could either give a couple resources or just maybe a little bit more in depth of tips and tricks maybe that you've learned about communicating to people. I feel like the more climate change conferences I go to, the more we're hearing don't lead with science. And to your point, the science is complicated. How do you communicate to a very general, non-technical audience what the science says? I feel like with climate policy, we're starting to hear, don't talk about the science unless it supports the other arguments you're making, and even then it's just really quick, in and out. So I'm wondering if you have found the same thing over the course of your work, and what strategies you might have.
Yeah, I think it totally depends on your audience. Some people want to know the science, and they want to know that at least some professionals have done that work, and so it's hard to identify who wants to hear it and who doesn't, but I think once you start talking to people, you'll kind of get a feel for it, and because some people want to know that the work has been done, but then you have a group of people that don't want to hear the science, they don't want to hear about the studies, so the best way to interact with them is kind of almost talk more in generalities, and so if you know the results of a study, maybe don't dive too deep in those details, but just talk a little bit more in generalities. And in general, we've had a change in our strategy recently on social media where even as recently as a couple months ago, we just didn't interact with anybody and we just let people say what they wanted to say. But recently we thought a lot about that, and the more we thought about it, the more we kind of realized that we know more about this project than anyone else, so we should be interacting with people. And so God bless our social media manager, and she's been just she responds to people individually, and she's had a huge response, a positive response, that because when you write something out and post it there, it's there for not only the person that you're responding to, but everybody. And so to write a well thought out comment that maybe touches on science, but also talks about some other things too, we've had a huge positive response from that. So I think that was kind of a good light bulb to learn, because we just let things happen and stay in the dark and for a long time. And we realized that probably wasn't the best way to interact with people.
Thank you so much, Neil. So next up, we have Chris Houle from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you everyone for coming here today. As Stephanie said, I'm Chris Houle. Currently work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as the restoration coordinator for the National Wildlife Refuge System. Prior to this position, I was with DER, where I gained a lot of the experience that I'm going to talk about today. And I want to just take a minute to give credit to DER, because from those, obviously I gained those experiences, but also borrowing a lot of slides and materials from my colleagues there, so thank you. Now, first, little disclaimer or preface. I won't be offended if you saw this item on the agenda and thought that this might be the most boring talk of the day. Believe me, the irony isn't lost that an engineer is here to talk to you about permitting. But really, I think that this is one of the most interesting topics around dam removal. It's really where you have the opportunity to get into that sausage making. It's where engineering is easy, in my opinion. Oftentimes you might have a complicating thing, but where the art really goes into projects is how you navigate within the regulatory guidelines and sort of how you communicate to facilitate your project through that process. Now, first, just quick overview, gonna touch on how permitting works for dam removal projects in Massachusetts, and discuss that the design and permitting processes are inherently linked. Permitting can be time consuming and costly, but it doesn't have to be with early planning and coordination. And one point I want to stress is that landowner participation is critical. Not only do you have to have, or not only do you want to have and strive to have that dam owner engage as part of the project, they need to be a signatory on permits, but you really want to bring in the other landowners that are going to be particularly affected by the project. That might be a landowner whose property you might need to cross and to access the dam or to do part of your project, but also those landowners that you might not be thinking about, those upstream water users that, with Jim's presentation, that might have a water intake or might have other stake in that water rights. So you need to get them at the table as early as possible, and engage them as part of the design and regulatory process. So just quick basics here. What is a permit? An official document giving someone authorization to do something. And the purpose is to protect diverse resources that we have here in Massachusetts, sensitive species, areas, historical assets, cultural assets, to protect the rights of the public. So that could be for public access or public use, some of those water rights that I talked about a minute ago, and help enforce laws and regulations. For better or for worse, New England has passed some of the first inland and coastal wetland protection laws, and we have a strong home rule here in Massachusetts. Not only does the state and federal agencies regulate these resources, but that authority has been delegated to the local communities here in Massachusetts, so local conservation commissions, for example. New England, of course, is a very densely populated densely populated area with lots of infrastructure. There's rich cultural history from European settlers and, of course, the native peoples before that. Lots of abutters on these projects, typically, and a wide-ranging, diverse opinions, as you heard from Neil earlier. So, regulatory climate here in Mass is, over the past decade, there's been a significant improvement in the climate and culture around dam removal permitting. These are some of the resources that Beth mentioned earlier in her presentation, which are really some of the best guidance out there. Even though it might be 2007, they're still super relevant for helping you help push your project through the process. Also in 2014, Mass DEP initiated some changes to the Wetland Protection Act, which help identify a pathway for streamlining of these projects, or ecological restoration projects, for example. But just recently, in January of this year, MEPA, or the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act, instituted changes that really helped codify the vision of those changes in 2014. So not only now do you have a streamlining process in the Wetlands Protection Act, but you also get that through the MEPA process, which I haven't been lucky enough to work on a project to take advantage of these new changes. But I think is going to be super helpful and expedite the process quite a bit. So the takeaway here on this slide is two things, really. Want to stress that the design and permitting processes are inherently linked. And if you were to kind of look at the size of the boxes, think about how much effort you might contribute to your project to those things, you really want to contribute almost an equal amount of effort to the permitting process as you would the design process. And secondly, any engineers here in the room might be familiar with putting projects through like a 30% design or 50% design, 75% design, different phases. And you want to think about the permitting process and link it to those phases. For example, you might bring a project to 30% design and use that for communicating your project with the Mass Historic Commission, or use that to start engaging with pre-consultation through the MEPA process. And then so on, you might go to 50% for MEPA, 75% for some of the other permitting steps. But again, just stressing that those steps are and should inherently be linked, and you should be thinking about that as you start your project. And then, of course, the ultimate goal is to get the project implementation. And not to forget about permitting there, once you get your project in construction, you will, en masse, have monitoring goals as part of, baked into the regulatory permits that you get for your project. So you're going to need to be thinking about monitoring and then communicating those issues back to those regulatory agencies. You're not done once you get to construction. So it's important to think about that and consider that in considering the monitoring as part of the development of your applications. So this slide here, busy slide, I'm not going to touch on everything, but the green boxes are really the major steps or major issues that you want to be thinking about when it comes to permitting your project. And then the text in red is the major approvals that you're going to need for your project most likely. And I'll use these sort of green boxes to kind of navigate and outline through this presentation. So the first kind of most important thing is to establish clear goals and establish clear objectives. So you may want to, identify, so if your goal is to provide fish passage, identify your objective of removing the full vertical extent of the dam to address that objective. Similarly, if you have an objective, or if your goal is to improve water quality, you might want to dredge sediment. Or if your goal is to eliminate public safety risks, you'll need to address and stabilize the surrounding infrastructure. So that's a critical point just to think about early in your project and communicate that. You want to make sure to describe your existing and proposed conditions well, identify your resource areas, and predict those anticipated changes that you expect from your project. If you remove a dam and you have large impoundment behind it, and that's going to change from a pond or a lake to a flowing river, you want to make sure you quantify those changes and again, communicate those anticipated changes. Define your construction method, sequences of work. So how are you going to access your dam? How are you going to sequence it? What's your water control going to look like? All that needs to be defined as early as possible, and you use that information to guide you through the rest of the process. Quantify impacts, as I said. And one thing that people's eyes can glaze over on this, but I really like reading and understanding the regulations because you're almost putting yourself in the shoes of the regulatory agency or the reviewer, and you're looking for those things that they're looking at when they're reviewing your application. So if you understand it as a project manager or a proponent, and you're giving the agency the tools that they need to help you in your process. So it's super valuable, in my opinion, to take the time and carve out some effort for that. And lastly, promote the project benefits. These are all things that regulatory agencies support as well, particularly in Mass. So highlight those. If you're restoring river processes, promote that. Talk about how many miles you're going to gain from your project. Talk about the water quality improvements, the public access improvements, or the other community benefits that you might gain. Consultation. So what I want to touch on here is this is really where you start the process. And it's important to engage your permitting staff as early as possible. Once you have a clear definition of what your project is, once you kind of know the footprint is, highly recommend setting up pre-permitting consultations with any of the agencies. I think most are very receptive to this. And you can often do an initial pre-consultation with MIPA, and they'll actually engage the Corps, DEP, et cetera. So you might actually only have one meeting. And if you're thinking, oh, this might be an expensive, added cost, for consulting services, it's really just a couple-hour meeting, and you can do them all virtually now. So it's really one of the most valuable steps. And what I wanted, sort of the first step in that regulatory process is really MIPA, right? And so it's important to know the triggers and thresholds that are incorporated under that review. And I'm not going to really spend too much time on it today, but there are new regulations for MIPA in relation to environmental justice areas and communities. So I encourage you to explore that more if your project is located in one of those areas. Unfortunately, dam removal projects, though, do seek a mandatory, or do trigger a mandatory requirement to prepare an environmental impact report under the MEPA process. But thankfully, with those reg revisions back in January, ecological restoration projects, as defined under the Wetland Protection Act, now qualify for exemption. So if you think your project can qualify as an ecological restoration project, your MEPA review process may be significantly simplified and expedited. That could put you maybe in that category of a 3-month timeline. Alternatively, if you are in an environmental justice community and you maybe don't qualify as an ecological restoration project, and you do have to perform the mandatory environmental impact report, you might be looking at a 6+ month timeline for your MEPA review. But again, this is just something you can try to establish early through that initial consultation, and potentially pre-application meeting with your MEPA reviewer. The great thing about MEPA, I think it's actually one of the most useful steps in the regulatory process, because the agencies like DEP and Dam Safety, others, they issue letters as part of that process, comment letters. And if you have questions for them, you can ask them those questions, and they often will get addressed in those letters. So you can say, hey, does Chapter 91 apply to my project? And they should respond. And so it can provide you a roadmap for your project. Moving on to sediment. Sediment is probably the most complicated aspect of dam removal projects in terms of regulations and requirements. Obviously, can come with huge project costs, can really impact how you strategize and plan your project. This primarily comes into play under the Section 401 of the Clean Water Act, which is a federal regulation or the water quality certification process. But in Massachusetts, this authority is delegated from the Army Corps to Mass DEP. As part of this, it's addressing, you need to address and identify quantity and quality of sediment. This comes into play if you have a project with greater than 100 cubic yards of sediment. So if you're under that, you might not need a 401, which is great. That'll kind of speed things up. But I'd say most projects do fall, dam removal projects do fall within the needing a 401. Sediment also comes into play in relation to the Section 404 of the Clean Water Act under dredge fill approval, and that is still administered by the Army Corps of Engineers. So here you really want to make sure you obviously identify the quality, identify potential impacts to human health and ecology, and potential impacts to public safety or surrounding infrastructure of your project. This is probably the permit or series of permits that require the most amount of time. And you want to allocate, I like to allocate, just assume about up to a year to navigate this, particularly for complicated projects. Their staff capacities of those agencies and the complexity of it can often require up to that. Dam safety, you will need, if your dam is a jurisdictional dam that is a low hazard class or greater, it will fall within the jurisdiction of the Office of Dam Safety, and they will have to issue you a permit under Chapter 253 of their regulations. And as part of that, you need to provide H&H or hydrology and hydraulic calculations. But the one good thing about the ODS review is it's relatively quick. I've seen reviews take 3 months or often less than that. But you do want to have some of the really logistics of your project sort of planned out in terms of design. So this might be one that you consider a little bit later in your timelines. Running out of time here, so I'm going to try to speed it up here. At the sensitive species is a critical issue for a lot of projects. A natural heritage and endangered species program will regulate rare species issues at the state level. Federal review will fall on the Fish and Wildlife Service and NOAA. And I provided links here for a couple tools that might be helpful as navigating those processes. That those federal reviews are now baked into the approval from the Army Corps that you'll need under Section 404. So those are really important to think about and take a look at. There was a new general permit issued in the spring by the Army Corps. So those are part of that now. So I encourage you to review that afterward. One good thing here about some of the state level reviews is that those are now embedded into the application process for ecological restoration projects. So you have to notify these agencies like DMF, DFW, Natural Heritage, the NISA process, that you have to do that for your project. So you just allocate the time for it, but it's already baked into it. So. And you might have time of year restrictions that are ultimately added to your project. So maybe avoiding work in the spring, migration periods, or what have you. Wetlands is kind of the big one here. This is regulated under the Wetlands Protection Act, administered by conservation commissions locally from DEP to the conservation commissions. What you file is a notice, what's called a notice of intent, gets sent to the commission as well as to the abutting properties. Dam removals all are called out as approved ecological restoration projects. So that essentially helps take the decision for the projects away from the conservation commissions in many cases. Obviously, you still need to present to them, but you have a regulatory pathway that says your project can proceed provided it meets a set of criteria. And what's important here is just to discuss those quantified changes. How will those wetland resources change? It's important to talk about conversions and not losses, right? So you might change land underwater to bordering vegetated wetland or isolated land subject to flooding or whatever it might be, bank. So you want to talk about your project in that way. I'm going to speed up here a bit. Here's the slides that sort of help communicate those changes. This is the dam removal slides from DER. Just after dam removal, you see the former impoundment unvegetated, and then with a short amount of time goes by and you start to see it revegetated. So now this is a conversion of resources, right? You changed a pond, a land underwater, to something like bordering vegetated wetlands. And the Wetlands Protection Act revisions in 2014 specifically outline a process to communicate those changes and that those changes are allowed. Waterways access is regulated under Chapter 91 of Mass General Laws administered by DEP. One thing that's important to know is if your site is currently licensed, in most cases dam removals should not need licenses, but there's some nuance to that. So again, this is one of those things you might want to bring up in those sort of early regulatory coordination meetings. See how it is applicable to your project. Navigability of rivers is also reviewed under Section 10 of the Rivers and Harbors Act, which is the Army Corps reviews. This timeline is a bit variable, but somewhere between 6 and 12 months. It can take up to 270 days to get a license signed. They ultimately need to be signed by the governor, so that process can take a while should you need one of those. Oftentimes you see the license requirements getting put onto infrastructure that is required to do your project. So like if you need to also upgrade a culvert or if you need to put a utility line through the river, that might be licensed. But rarely would you, if you're removing a dam, should you have to license that. All right, I think I can speed up. Okay. Historic begins kind of backing up. This is going to be one of those first things you want to do with that early coordination. But this begins with filing a project notification form with the Mass Historic Commission. It is required by the Army Corps as well, so you're going to have to do this regardless to get your 404 approval. And that filing goes to the Mass Historic Commission as well as regional tribes that might, or TIPOs that might be interested in your project or the area of your project. One thing that's important to know here is who is your lead federal agency on your project. If you have a federal partner, often that will be your lead federal agency, not always. At a minimum, you will get a lead federal agency through that Army Corps review process. But that's just important to know because that can shape how you communicate, the process of communication around historical issues, cultural issues. You may need your lead federal agency to take that role in doing that communication, nation-to-nation communication, or federal agency to state communication. Review timeline is variable. If no major issues, it can be relatively quick. Alternatively, if you need to develop a memorandum of agreement or anything like that, that can take a lot longer. And again, going back to baking this into your design processes, you really need to advance your design process concurrent with the development of an MOA, should you need one. Federal agency impacts reviewed under NEPA kind of goes back to the lead federal agency discussion. This will always be the Army Corps, if you don't already have a federal agency involved, like the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA or FEMA potentially. I'm trying to speed up here. There's different steps that might be needed depending on the aspects of your projects. You might need an environmental assessment if it's you have the Fish and Wildlife Service involved. Proceed here. Construction, this is kind of a catch-all, but there might be other approvals that you might need for your project that don't fall nicely into those other bins. A local building permit may require, your town might require something like a local building permit. You might, if your project's over an acre, you might need to file a NIPDES, SWIP, and that is often done by the contractors, but not always. You might have requirements of solid waste disposal or specific disposal requirements for sediment if you need to haul material off-site. You might need a fishway permit from Mass Division of Marine Fisheries if you're on an Adramus fish run. Chapter 85 bridge review if you're doing a culvert in concert with your dam removal, not uncommon to have to address some downstream infrastructure. I'm going to skip this slide, but this is just for your resource later. This is kind of a roadmap of what, not to say every project will fall into this bin, but something to sort of use as a guide. Totally switching gears, I was asked to talk a bit about dam ownership and liability as part of this presentation, and I'm not an attorney, so I'm not really in the best position to answer a lot of those questions. However, DER partnered with Harvard Law a few years back to develop this guide, which is super useful, and I provide a link at the bottom, and it addresses some of the major questions that you might have from an ownership perspective or liability perspective. Liability from flooding, legal rights to remove a dam. You can kind of go through this list, but these are the 7 sort of main questions that this document addresses. And I'm going to end here on this slide. One, because it's probably my favorite dam removal slide or picture that I've ever taken from the Balmoral Dam removal in Andover, Massachusetts. You see designs, you see the site, you think about how it might take place, but never in my wildest dreams did I expect to see an excavator lifted up from a crane and plopped into a tent in the middle of a river. It just never occurred to me that this is what it would look like. So one, I think it's just a really cool photo. But the other thing that's super relevant to this gentleman's question about what do you do when you don't know the owner? Or what do you do when you can't identify the owner? And maybe you have a town that really wants to push a project, but again, you just can't identify that owner. And this is one of the few examples that I'm aware of in Massachusetts that was that exact scenario. Here you had the town, if there's anyone from town of Andover too, I'd love for you to chime in during the Q&A. This was a project that was led, sponsored by the town of Andover on a privately owned dam surrounded by town property. And there had been some flooding, Mother's Day floods contributed to flooding, so they wanted to really address this piece of aging infrastructure. Through title research, found it was some sort of delinquent owner down south North Carolina, I believe, and the town instituted a sort of taking of the dam. And so they sent notifications, series of notifications, say, hey, dam owner, we're interested in removing your dam. Let us know if you have an issue with this. Obviously in lawyer terms, but that's essentially what they communicated over a period of time. And they were very smart too, and by never taking ownership of it until all the permits were secured, they had a construction, they already went to bid, they had a construction contract signed, ready to go or ready to be signed, and right at that time they took ownership or did a taking of the dam in order to remove it, right? So they owned it only for a very small amount of time. So it was a smart play on their part. I would encourage, if there's anyone in the audience that has a similar situation, to reach out to this community. I can try to track down some folks for contact information, but a pretty unique example and pretty successful. So with that, I'll open it up, and sorry again for going a little over.
Thank you so much. Anyone who's good at math might have noticed on the agenda that it doesn't always add up timing-wise. That's because we put some buffer time in there, so we're all set on that. We knew there were going to be a lot to talk about.
Hello, Peter Coffin from the Blackstone. 10, 15 years ago, Tim Puritan had led the charge on what we thought was the low-hanging fruit of Millbury Electric Dam, which is already partially partially breached, owned by National Grid. Came up with the cost, it was going to be like $1.5 million because of the contaminated sediments. Was wondering if there is a chance to revive a project by capping and filling rather than sending the sediments out to Ohio. If there is land available on site, is that a doable way to do it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not familiar with that specific project, but I'll give you a brief story of a project that I worked on while I was at DER in Pittsfield, and that scenario that you just described was essentially that project in Pittsfield, where initially the cost estimates based on the sediment quality and quantity were extremely high and pretty much made the project infeasible. But things changed, not only from a site standpoint where part of the dam failed and some sediment moved downstream conveniently, but also the regulatory environment changed during that period as well. And it opened doors in terms of how you think about your sediment management strategy and how it was applied to that project. Similarly, there were still issues that couldn't be addressed. There was still a large volume of sediment that needed to be dealt with. There was still poor quality sediment that needed to be dealt with. And that shaped the design of the project. So it involved a range of strategies. It involved dredging and kind of capping in place, as you said. It involved dredging and disposal, hauling off-site. So a mix of strategies to kind of best use the available funding that was there, but also address the public safety issues and public health issues around the sediments at that site. So not a perfect answer to your question, but I would say never just close the book on a project. Always look for opportunities as they come available, and going back to one of my statements earlier is understand the regulations and follow those changes. And you never know which avenue you might find if you put a little bit of energy at trying to find those answers. So. And then also talk to your colleagues in this realm. There's plenty of resources here that I'm sure your example is not one that others haven't heard too. So don't be afraid to ask questions and ask for help.
That's actually a great point, and I would encourage you all during lunch. We have one more presentation. Grab your coffee. We can do this. Sit with people you don't know during lunch and chat about the kind of projects that you're working on or interested in working on, and there's so much expertise already in this room. We picked a few really smart folks to come up here and talk with everybody, but I know that all of you have experiences that are valuable to one another as well. Other questions? We have time for one or two more. Thank you for waiting.
Sorry, making you run all the way. Super informative, thanks, Chris. But we were actually just wondering, since you ended on that, how that seems like the right strategy for the town to wait to the very end to do it. But how do they get permits without the landowner?
That was a really good question, and that popped in my head when I put this thing together, and I was hoping nobody was going to ask me that question. I don't know. I actually don't have that answer, but. I have some theories that maybe I'll talk to you about offline, but yeah, I don't know.
That's a non-recorded answer to share. One more question over here.
Hi, I'm Jill Griffiths. Thanks, Chris. That was a great presentation. I was curious about the sequencing of 401 versus NOI for ecological restoration projects, because I know the NOI seems to require the issued 401 water quality certificate, but the 401 process hasn't really required it, but with the new online application, I don't know if you've dealt with that yet, but it has like required boxes, and it seems to be really kind of requiring a lot of upfront stuff, including filing the NOI. So I just didn't know if you had any thoughts on sequencing those two things.
Interesting. I have not seen the online version of it. I will say that it is well understood within DEP that there is that sort of conflict between the two. So I encourage you to talk to your reviewers and discuss how to navigate through that challenge. That being said, as written, it's required if you want to seek authorization for your project under the ecological restoration avenue. You have to receive your 401 water quality certificate first, and as you probably saw on the slide, it can often take a year or more to get that approval. So that is something you just need to consider as part of your planning process. There might be other avenues that you can explore with your reviewer to get around those issues. But I do know DEP is also working to try to resolve some of those challenges. So to touch on your question about filing an NOI, I think I found through the Chapter 91 process, they also require issuance of your order conditions to get your Chapter 91 approval. But they often want to just see the narrative as part of that too. So if you have the document prepared and ready, you could send that. Even though you haven't filed it, you can send that, and that might be enough information for them to check the boxes that they need to do, because they need to look at those impacts to the resources that are within their jurisdiction, right? So they need to understand what those expected changes are going to be. So you might move those applications in terms of the production of them, but not filing concurrently, but then you hold off on the file. You sequence the filing appropriately. So not a perfect answer, but something, again, I encourage you to talk to your reviewers once they're assigned.
I think there's a theme of no perfect answers in permitting. It sounds like.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question before our last speaker. One more question? Yep.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for powering through it on that one. As far as non-jurisdictional, an ODS concern, if you think you have a non-jurisdictional dam, or you do have one, can you just talk a little bit about, do you still have to get approval, or similar to a a negative determination, conscom, that sort of thing, do you still have to sort of go through the process, or how's that go?
Yeah, good question. If I can back up here just for a minute. So non-jurisdictional dam, you wouldn't need to address the dam safety at Chapter 253 aspects, which is great. But you would potentially still need to address the other issues that show up on this slide. So if you're also under 100 cubic yards of sediment with that non-jurisdictional dam, some of those sediment issues could go away. If your footprint is under 5,000 square feet, then maybe some of your 401 issues could go, 401 and wetlands issues could go away. The Ecological Restoration Project filing also addresses wetlands impact up to, I think it's 5,000 square feet. So there's, it kind of depends, you follow that same theme, is it, you need to kind of know the entirety of the resources that will be impacted by it. So it's not a perfect answer, but it definitely makes it easier, a little bit easier, and then as those other impacts or other things, issues start to, those quantities are lower, this process can get a little simpler.
So how many folks in the room are from one of these agencies that people would need a permit from? Okay, a few. So maybe we can all just bug you at lunch as well and have those early conversations casually, off the record. All right, thank you so much, Chris. Next up, we have Bill Hinckley from EEA, Energy and Environmental Affairs. And you can give us more of your exact title there. There you go.
Oh, thank you very much. All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Bill Hinckley. I recognize that I am what's standing between you and your lunch. So it's me. I'm the problem. It's me. Just briefly about me, with the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, under the leadership of Secretary Rebecca Tepper, which is an executive office within the state system, the state of Massachusetts. And one of my things that I do, my role there is to administer a program called the Dam and Seawall Repair and Removal Program. It's a capital program funded by the Governor's Capital Investment Plan, which comes out annually. But right now what I'm going to talk about, I'm not going to talk about individual funding programs so much in this presentation. There's a lot of them out there. I don't want to get into too many specifics. I want to talk a little bit more about overall funding. And then if we have time, we can get into some different funding sources and then maybe some tips about how we do that. As some of the other speakers have said, this is a long and expensive process to do this. There's no easy answers for any of this. And so I guess if you're ready to spend your next 10 years of your life with me, then we can get started, because that's what it's going to take. On this aside, all the pictures in this presentation are just for eye candy. They don't necessarily correlate to anything about what I'm saying here. Something to think about, something to look at when you don't want to think about money. So at any rate, when we're talking about funding dam projects and dam removal projects, we're really thinking about three key categories, right? So the first one, and I think the one that a lot of the folks who are regulators think about, is the safety elements. And that's what I'm going to talk about most today. I think most of us here are in the room because we're really attracted by the ecological benefits of a dam removal. And there's myriad of them, and we've talked about them, but I really want to get into the safety elements. And so what we're most interested in regarding safety is dams that don't comply with dam safety regulations. If you own a dam, you're required to be in compliance with dam safety regulations. But throughout the state, we'll find that a lot of these structures are not. We also talk about resiliency, and lately we have a lot of resiliency programs. And when it comes to dams, trying to not overlap our funding, one of the things we really think about, what are the other effects that a dam may have on the environment and people living in the environment? So when we're talking about overtopping and failure, we're really talking about the safety elements. When we're talking about other impacts, so does the dam exacerbate low flow conditions? Does it exacerbate high flow conditions? Does it have other impacts? We're not worried about the dam overtopping or washing away. We're thinking about its other impacts. And then finally, we have programs around ecology. And what we're thinking about this, regardless of the size, regardless of the hazard, a dam, even at a dam in excellent condition, is still going to disrupt those river functions. So there's a whole series of funding opportunities that are related to the ecology. But like I said, I think today what I really want to stress is the importance of the safety elements and the funding that's available to consider the safety benefits of a dam removal project. And so what I said here is think safety. There are so many benefits of removing a dam, and the one that really I find is compelling to a lot of people in the public, a lot of funders, is the safety benefits. At just this point, I do want to shout out to the Office of Dam Safety at the Department of Conservation and Recreation. They're the regulatory agency around dams. They're an extraordinary resource. It's a small team that works really hard. I will say that they, along with your local DPWs and the engineering companies that work with them, those are the people who are out there in the middle of the night being cold and wet so that you can sleep soundly. And so just want to make sure that we recognize those folks who are out there thinking about safety all the time. And when you get a rain, like we did in Leominster the other day, they're the ones sleeping with the cell phone next to their heads so that they're going to get called out in the middle of the night. So the thing I really want to stress here about the safety is our dam safety regulations in Massachusetts, and that's 302 CMR 10. And what the dam safety regulations do is it really categorizes the way we think about dams. And we've talked about, in a couple of the presentations just touched on it, we talk about dams about how much damage they could do were they to fail. And the ones that we really are worried about or concerned about are two different classifications that are outlined in those dam safety regs. We call those high hazard potential dams. And that's a dam where a failure, and it's here, but I'm sure that the presentations will be available later, would likely cause loss of life and serious damage to homes, industrial, commercial facilities, important public utilities, highways, railroads. This is really important stuff. So this is a dam that, and dams are going to have risk whether they're in good condition or they're in poor condition, because they're always just going to be holding that water. And so we think about those high hazards and then step down a little bit where we have significant hazard class dams where you get into the may cause loss of life, injury, damage to homes, things like that. So that's something we really think about a lot. We also classify dams on their physical condition. And that's, again, something that's outlined in the regulations. And the two situations that we really think about most are those dams that we consider in poor or unsafe physical condition. So when you have a combination of a poor or unsafe hazard physical condition dam that is a high or significant hazard class, that's where those red boxes come in. And that's really where we get into the highest priorities for your safety funders. We think about that a lot. And that's really, I think, those are the structures that keep us up at night the most. And so what are we worried about? We're worried about people. We're worried about homes and businesses. We're worried about where people go. We're worried about people, vulnerable populations. We're worried about hospitals. We're worried about schools. And then we're also worried about continuity of infrastructure. And I've just got some here: roads, rails, utilities, things like that, things that are going to disrupt everyday life. And so those red squares, those are the hot spots. Those are, I hate to say the sweet spot because they're really anything but when you're looking for safety funding, those dams that are in that condition are the ones that are really going to capture attention. And I put a link here to the National Inventory of Dams. And if you haven't looked at this, it's a really cool resource. And this is every dam in the country. And it gives you a little bit of information, and actually a lot of information depending on the dam, about what's out there, what kind of hazard class it is, what kind of condition it's in, a little bit about the ownership, a lot of good information on there. So if you're just getting started with a thought about, hey, what is this dam and what's anybody doing about it, that's a great place to look first. And this threat of failures is something we think about a lot. These are just some in the last few months, a year or so. We've got one in Hinsdale about a year ago. East Bridgewater was a failure, which is near my home, and that was in January. This one in Leominster was very concerning. And then this one is looking at the potential for an unsafe dam in again, so one of those zombie dams, which happens to be in Pittsfield. So this is something that's a real thought, and we think about a lot. So as you're thinking about the funding and getting towards the funding and thinking about decisions, you think about also the things in the regulations that are costly to your community. So the costs vary by the hazard classification of your structure. So if you have a high hazard structure, you're going to be required to submit to the Office of Dam Safety an inspection every 2 years. And those are costly. They cost a lot of money to do. You have to get professional engineers out there, and they need to do their work, and it does take time and money to do that. And a lot of correspondence back and forth with the Office of Dam Safety. That goes down a little bit based on the hazard classification of the dam. You're required to have an emergency action plan. What happens if this dam is to go bad? Happily, the city of Leominster had one that we all saw in the news. It was activated, and people were kept safe. We talked a little bit about liability and insurance. Whether that's listed on anyone's policy is probably unlikely, but the liability is still there. There's maintenance and repair. And then when we think about a change in climate and more intense rainfall, more flashy rainfall, and we think about the actual capacity of the spillways to carry water, we're finding that those are becoming inadequate. And there's going to be future conditions where there's going to be more water. So you think about, well, what is the future condition and how am I going to keep this dam in compliance? And so maybe down the line, it's going to be just easier and cheaper to remove it. Before we get into some of the funding elements, I also want to talk a little bit about some of the major cost drivers for dam removals. There's things that are expensive and we know, and things that may be expensive depending on your site, and there's often a lot of surprises. As Jim mentioned, sometimes a surprise dam that we didn't know was there, and he's right, we've seen plenty of those. But a couple of things that are always expensive. Bridges and culverts are always expensive. Moving utilities is always expensive and it's always time consuming. Contaminated sediment is always expensive. Poor site access. A lot of these dams are actually hard to get to. We're looking at a couple in Drake right now where they're wedged in between two mills, and I have no idea, that's going to be one of the major keys, is how on earth you're going to get heavy equipment down there. Railroads, always expensive and always time consuming. Railroads are not really interested in your project, and they may or may not be helping in any way whatsoever. Again, back to Pittsfield. Dams in series, if you've got more than one dam, that's going to add to your cost. Even if the others are not getting removed, you have to think about the ultimate impacts on that. And fish ladders are always expensive. Some other things that may be surprises, we've talked a little bit about ownership. Who owns this dam? Is it the municipality? Is it a private owner? Is it nobody? And there's certainly some of those. Abutting structures, that's a major consideration. I was talking about this project in the Ipswich, and there's a lot of times there's a building that is adjacent to the dam or touching the dam, or the dam is part of the abutment of the building. They want to keep their building safe, and that may be additional cost. Sometimes there's a road over the dam. Oh, geez, already? Timelines and MEPA permits, that can drag out your project to longer than you expected. Sometimes you have to mitigate against your own environmentally beneficial project, and that adds cost. If you have to actively manage your sediment, if you actually have to dredge, that can add cost. Big surprise is how much construction is at any given time. And whether a crew or a construction company thinks that they can do the job for the price that you think the job should cost. Your bids may come in at a space that's a lot higher. This is a really, this market is really, there's a lot of inflationary pressure on this market. And that's really going to be, in many cases, a big surprise. And then finally, surprises in the impoundment. You never know. Little surprises of unexpected PCBs or other things can really drive up your cost. So Chris talked a bit about some of these design stages, and I'll tell you that every one of these stages has a cost associated with it. And I know that I don't want to go through how much each one of these things costs, but I guess that the key takeaway is don't be surprised when your design cost is is into the the low to mid six figures. Doesn't surprise me at all. This stuff is expensive. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of experts. So yeah, you can be looking $100,000, $250,000. Depends. Everything depends. Depends on all those factors. That's substantially more than my house cost when I bought it. Not once upon a time. It's a lot of money to try to come up with. So I guess maybe the thing to do at this point, we talk a lot about safety, and we talked a lot about some of the costs. Maybe the thing that's helpful is to talk about some different funding sources that may be out there, depending on your particular project. And I can start with the one that I manage, which is the Dam and Seawall Program at EEA. Just trying to see what else is on the list. This is the last slide I have. But again, these are different, and the thing is, no program that you apply to is going to be able to manage pay for your project soup to nuts. Yeah, sorry. So there's not going to be anything out there that you can apply to, and it's a one-stop shop and you're done. This is ultimately going to be a puzzle. It's going to be a really complicated, difficult, painful puzzle to come up with the money to do this. Again, Jim talked about the price of a dam removal. If one comes in under $1 million, I'm always a little surprised. These are really expensive, overwhelmingly expensive projects. And the more of those complicating factors, the more we see. So sometimes if there's a bridge, your $1 million dam removal is now a $7 million dam and bridge replacement. And that's not surprising to your funders at all. So there's a couple different sources out here and things that we can look at. But again, I'm hoping to just get into a couple things, oh so briefly, that may be just some quick tips. First of all, the most important thing to do is to understand the programs you're applying to. So you can look at some of these programs. Every public agency is required to post their bids and their opportunities publicly. And we leave them there for posterity. So in the state, we have a system called COMBUYS, C-O-M-M-B-U-Y-S. Every single grant that we've ever put out there lives on COMBUYS. And you can go in there and you can take a look and see what the programs look like. You can see what the programs from the bids from the past look like. You can see a lot of times what the old application forms look like. These exist and you can take a look. They also exist on grants.gov, which is the federal system. So the key is to really understand what you're getting into and understand if the program is going to apply to your particular dam removal, because they're all so different. The next thing is to make sure you're eligible. Every program is going to have different eligibility criteria. Not everyone is going to be eligible for every program. So for instance, coming out soon, the FEMA High Hazard Potential Dam Program. It's actually a really exciting program, but the only one who can apply is MEMA. And then MEMA will work with local municipalities and dam owners to try to figure out who are going to be the subrecipients. But that's something that is important to understand when you look at these programs, who can apply. You don't want to do a lot of work for nothing. And also the type of dam owner often means a lot. Some, if it's a privately owned dam, are going to have different opportunities than a publicly owned dam. Also really important is to know your audience when you're applying. I would say at least within the state, all of us know who are reviewing your program and your applications. We probably know the individual dam. We probably know the river. We probably know all the potential benefits. We have resources at our disposal to go check it out. So you don't need to, so you need to recognize that when you're applying, we at least have a baseline sense of who you're talking to. And so what we're really looking for, and so we're bureaucrats, and we're fairly proud of that. And so we already know the background. So what we just stick to the facts and understand that when your reviewers are going to be looking at a lot of these. So last round, dam and seawall program, 50 applications. MVP program, the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, 113 applications, right? So the key here is to don't add a lot of flowery language, stick to what matters, stick to the benefits, as Chris mentioned, for the permits, same thing. We're not, we're not talking about really get into sort of the intangibles. Oh, it's a very beautiful pond and people love it. That's less important to us than really getting down into the weeds of the specifics of the hazard around that structure. I will say to stick to what is asked for in that same vein. That procurement document, that bid document, that grant document, it's going to tell you exactly what we're looking for. And the key is to really follow that closely and be sure that what's asked for is put in. And then a couple other things, and just give me one of these when it's time, because I'll just keep going. The budget really, really matters. I can't impress enough how much that budget matters. I think a lot of the grant reviewers can probably just take all of your words and throw them away and look at just your budget and tell exactly what you're going to do. And we can look at it line by line. The narrative is nice, it gives us some helpful information, but we can really tell what's happening by the budget. And so, but for a lot of people, the last thing they want to look at or think about is the budget. I might start there first and then put your narratives to reinforce that budget, because that ultimately, the budget is what's going to be in your contract. And if you didn't spend any time on it or put any thought into it, all of a sudden you're stuck with it. And if you're stuck with it, the only way to change it is with a contract amendment. And that's going to cost you time and money and effort. Let's see, and again, just give me the, all right. And then I just want matching funds. Almost every program is going to involve it. All right, so there's no program out there that's going to provide you with all the money you need, even if it can be done with one project. Every program is going to require some match. And then I will end by saying the number one reason a good project that hits all the boxes gets declined is time. Your timeline, your timeline, your timeline. Everything around your funder relies on how long they have access to that money. So for a capital project, a capital program, we're allocated our money annually. We don't know if we have any money next year. So we have to get the project done this year. Sometimes we guess that we're going to get money, but we don't know that. And so everything we do is we think about time. And so be sure, if the proposal says this has to be done by June 30th, 2024, don't apply for money to go to 2026. We don't have it. So you've really got to pay attention to those timelines. They're federal, they're state, they're private. Everybody has it. And that's the biggest part of the puzzle, is figuring out your timeline on your permits, your timeline on your bid, your timeline on your construction, and the timeline of the funds that are available. Because if I don't spend it, it goes away forever. So I've got to get that money out the door in this year, because I may not get it next year. I'll stop there. Sorry.
Thank you. Great job.
Lunchtime.
We're going to leave you on that positive note before lunch of there's tons of money out there. You just have to get it, right? Questions for Bill? Yeah.
Hi, Lisa Kump from Charles River Watershed Association. Thanks so much for your overview. It's really helpful. When you highlighted the Office of Dam Safety and their classifications of different dams, I'm wondering, does the Office of Dam Safety take climate change considerations into account when they are classifying different dams in terms of hazard status?
So the hazard status is set out in regulation. right? And so they may be able to do that based on the spillway capacity, right? But generally speaking, we're looking at the physical condition and what could be damaged downstream, right? So that's really, and if anyone else wants to pipe in, especially those who've worked with ODS, it's what could be damaged rather than as the dam stands today, right? So if we're looking at a high hazard dam, it's really what's living downstream, people, buildings, things like that, rather than what could happen in the future based on a future condition.
Other?
Is there any plan to consider like increased rainfall, higher precipitation events, that kind of thing? In terms of like frequency of potential liability?
I don't know, but really what we're worried about in terms of hazard classification, when you go back, oh no, go back. Ah, jeez. So it's really in that definition of the hazard classifications, it's almost entirely based on what's going to happen downstream. The physical condition of the dam does include the adequacy of the spillway capacity. Can it handle the rain? And that is where you would actually probably be looking at the changing condition. And that's going to depend though on, and a lot of times, and you can check, I hope someone will check me going backwards, we're using backdated information, right? We don't project forward when we set up those spillway capacities. We have to use the vetted data sets. It used to be Atlas 14, and the name of the new one escapes me, but we're looking at previous data to figure out, does that have the adequate capacity? And those change periodically, but it's always a rearward facing.
I may be able to help answer that question a little bit as well. So once a dam's hazard classification is established based on the risk to people and infrastructure downstream, the regulations require a certain spillway design flood based on that hazard classification. Often when you have a high hazard or a significant hazard dam, that spillway design flood is based on the probable maximum precipitation, which is a storm, think about your 100-year storm, which is where a lot of our stormwater regulations stop. That's like on the very, very small end of PMP size storms. So you're looking at the probable maximum, the meteorological maximum precipitation that could fall in an area based on moisture content, heat, and stuff like that. So most of those studies go back to the hydrometeorological reports number 51 and 52. However, there are organizations, there are firms that are evaluating site-specific and state-specific PMP studies. Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Colorado, New Mexico are all doing these types of studies. And they're showing that the intensity of the PMP is changing, which increases the amount, or it sometimes decreases the amount of rainfall that's expected. But in general, climate change and the impact of climate change on the size of the PMP varies depending on where you are in the country. So it's not always going to be an increase. It could, in some cases, be a decrease. So the size of your spillway is typically based on this probable maximum precipitation, which does not always directly correlate to climate change in the way that we typically think about it in more intense and more frequent storms. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Ann Hausman. I'm with Hazen and Sawyer.
Thank you.
And just to follow up on that one a little bit, again, with the backwards looking, so in Leominster, going back about a month, I think the spillway capacity and more or less was expected to handle about 6.6 inches of rain, and we got 11 inches of rain. So there you have it.
Just Allison Field-Juma from ORS Watershed Organization, just to note that in our watershed, some of the worst floodings happen because we've had storms in close series. So the river hasn't had a chance to clear before the next storm happens. And so that would seem to actually elevate the problematic flooding, even though the rating of the storm has not changed. Does that make sense?
It does, but that's more of a, and in terms of funding, it's certainly something we'd be concerned about. But in terms of actually affecting the hazard class and the physical rating, that may or may not be something that would be considered, at least in this regulatory scheme. Yep.
So thank you so much to Bill. And thank you to all of our speakers this morning and to our sponsors. I encourage you to go check out those tables and resources over there. So feel free to get up and get lunch. We've got an hour for lunch. We'll come back at 12:30. Just a note that everything's vegetarian, so if you're a vegetarian, that's easy. There's also a plate specifically of vegan and gluten-free sandwiches if folks need those, and they are labeled. So thank you. And I encourage you to sit with folks you don't know at lunch, network, have good conversations.